In this video we want to consider negotiations. Now, one quite famous definition of negotiations is that two parties coming together to confer with a view to making a jointly acceptable agreement by the use of purposeful persuasion and constructive promise. So that's what we mean by negotiations. It's when two parties come together, freely come together, with the purpose of making some agreeable outcome, finding a solution to a problem that's acceptable to both sides. And they use purposeful persuasion, we'll talk about this in a moment, and constructive compromise. Now, negotiation occurs when a minimum of two parties come together to reach a mutual agreement. So clearly we need at least two parties. If there's just one party, there can't be a dispute. We don't argue with ourselves. So minimum of two, but there may be more involved in some more complex employee relationships, I should say, perhaps. So, but generally speaking, there must be at least two. The aim in negotiations is to resolve differences between the groups. That's why they come together. They come together to talk about the problem, to try to find a solution. Resolving differences allows for effective communication and cooperation within groups. So each group must have a very clear picture of what they want and what the grievance is. They must be able to communicate amongst themselves and agree to modifications or changes as the negotiations proceed. But they also must be able to communicate clearly to the other parties involved in the negotiations about problems and issues that they confront and the likely implications of any proposed changes. So, all in all, there must be an effective communications system operating both within individual parties to the negotiation and across the negotiations also. Now, if we go back to the definition we talked about at the start, Gennard and Judge, we said two parties coming together to confer with a view to making a jointly acceptable agreement by use of purposeful persuasion and constructive compromise. Now, I want to talk about these because they're important elements in the negotiation process. So let's see what's meant by these. We'll start with purposeful persuasion. Both parties aim to achieve their objectives by persuading the opposing party to accept their case or demands. So the opening parts of the negotiation is when both parties try to persuade the opposing party to accept their position. Of course, that's very unlikely to happen. That's just the opening moves in the negotiations. But they're trying to persuade them. They're trying to make the case as to why the opposing party should agree with them. So they make a case that tries to persuade the others to agree. This is achieved through debating and communications, and also communicating factual information and analysis. So there's good debating and good communications skills involved in negotiations, but also trying to produce facts and figures and trying to analyze the implications of any particular change and trying to construct a case as to why the other party should agree. It's trying to persuade them to agree. It's purposeful. It's got a purpose. It's persuasion for a purpose. The purpose being industrial peace and the fact that one of the parties got what they wanted. But right the way through the negotiations, this purposeful persuasion will be in play. Right the way through, The different parties will make cases as to why their position is reasonable, it's the best outcome, why the others should adopt it. They're trying to persuade them, they're trying to make the case, and that any alternative to what they're proposing would somehow be inferior. Now, constructive compromise. Well, this takes place when both parties are willing to reach a common ground. It's constructive. They're trying to help each other to try to resolve the issue, and they're trying to find a compromise, one that both of them can agree with. So they're looking for the common ground. Both parties acknowledge the need to work together in order to achieve any outcome. So they recognize their interdependence, and they're trying to find a compromise, and they're being constructive. They're trying to be helpful. Both parties aim to accommodate the demands of the other party by identifying parameters to reach common ground. They're trying to work out how far they can go and what sort of compromises can they make, and looking for compromises on the other side as well, so that if both give ground, both try to compromise, both are trying to resolve the issue and get a fair solution. That's constructive compromise. Negotiations can take place at a personal, corporate, or international level. So there's no scale to negotiations. That can take place at any level. The principle of negotiation is to give and take. The main outcome can be a win-win solution or a win-lose solution. If there is a situation of a very destructive strike or lockout, that I suppose you could describe as a lose-lose situation. Both parties lose. But we'll ignore that possibility. A win-win is when both parties get something out of the negotiations. Both parties can go back and think they've won something. Both parties feel like they've been winners. A win-lose is when one party dominates the negotiations, forces compromise and forces solutions and wins the arguments and so on, and they're the winners, but perhaps the other one then is the loser. So we have these categorizations of win-win, lose-lose, or as I said earlier, we could even have a lose-lose. Both parties acknowledge a conflict of interest and will use strategies and tactics to influence a favourable deal. So they are clever people, they are intelligent people who are sitting down to negotiate, trying to get the best outcome for themselves and for, in the case of the unions, for their membership, in the case of the management, for their stakeholders. So there is negotiations in place and both parties are trying to win the argument. Both parties in negotiations will work towards achieving their demands. They try to get what they wanted. This is what they set out to get, and this is what they're trying to achieve. They'll try to also work together to compromise. Generally speaking, they recognize the mutuality of the situation. Both of them want, let's say, the company to continue. Both of them have jobs and they need the incomes. They need the company to continue. So they have to give ground. They have to compromise. They can't damage the company. If the company closes down as a consequence, they will all lose their incomes. So there's a recognition that they need to compromise. They need to perhaps sometimes invent new ideas and solutions. So both parties will feel that they've won something. It's very unusual that they can find such solutions, but sometimes they do come up with perhaps new suggestions. Management will agree to a different way of working and perhaps shorter working hours, but perhaps the introduction of new technology, which will be more productive. So there are all sorts of compromises and negotiation stances to be taken and to be discussed and debated and argued over. But the idea is that they're not going to try and damage the business too much. Going into negotiations can have a negative impact on relationships between the parties and can cause ill feelings and resentment. The negotiations starkly illustrate the two sides, and perhaps management was working more towards a more cohesive organisation, one where the workers were involved and their decisions were taken into account, and there was more a feeling of everyone was in it together and everyone was working towards a common end. But when negotiations come into place, there is a clear divide. There are the workers on the one side perhaps and management on the other. There's a clear visible divide between the two, and they can cause ill feelings and bad feelings, and it can cause long run the destruction of good understanding between them and trust between them in the long run. So there is a problem in having negotiations. If negotiation is to be successful, both parties need to actively engage in achieving the best possible outcome. So both of them are arguing for their position, and they're trying not to give ground. They're trying to hold the position as much as they can. So negotiations can be long and hard. Sometimes the negotiations will involve experts. They will involve expert negotiators on the part of the trade union, expert negotiators on the management side. And these know how to work every angle and try to get the biggest outcome for their respective side. So they don't want to compromise if they can help it. But if they recognize that the negotiations is not moving and it's getting to a dangerous stage, then they may engage in compromise, constructive to try and advance the negotiations, to try and resolve the issue, and they will give some ground. But at the early stages in negotiations, positions tend to be quite hard, and neither party want to give too much away at the early stages. Negotiation is reliant on cooperation and competitive tactics. The process involves exchange of proposals and counter-proposals to achieve a win-win solution. Both sides want to go back and say they've won. Both sides want to show that they have gained something out of the negotiations. So both sides are interested in the outcome. But in order to get to the outcome, they will make proposals, and there will be counter-proposals and objections and rejections, and so the whole process could be long, drawn out, and quite complicated. And perhaps they're arguing over small points a lot of the time, but they see every point as important. Both parties know that they can influence the opposing party and the outcome. Insofar as they're in negotiations, the assumption is that both parties want a solution. So they're trying to outmaneuver the other party. They're trying to get them to agree to some proposal which will be in their interest and which will appear in the opponent's interest as well. But in fact, in practice, it doesn't give the opponents too much. So that's why there is need for reflection and thought and careful consideration before anyone agrees to the terms of the negotiation, to make sure they're not agreeing to something which is not in their interest. But all of that being said and done, both parties do want an outcome. They want an outcome which will preserve the jobs of the workers and will preserve the business for the stakeholders as well. So they are working within that constraint. So these are some ideas about negotiations and what's taken into account in negotiations. Please make some notes of this video and add it to other notes that you may have collected on the topic. That's all I'm going to deal with right now. So I'll say that's the source that I mentioned earlier, and that's all I'm going to do here. So thank you for watching.